Welcome to Inside Exchange, Topics for Manufacturers, a series bringing you expert-led presentations on the issues that matter most to members. The curated topics in this series feature presentations from associate members and subject matter experts through on-demand and live webinars to help Hudson Valley manufacturers. If you have topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes, contact us at info@councilofindustry.org. Let's begin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Inside Exchange. Today, I'm joined by Jillian Terhune, Senior Project Manager at Langan Engineering. Langan is a leading engineering and environmental consulting firm. Jill and the Langan team are a tremendous resource for the Council of Industry and our members, providing expertise on environmental regulations and compliance. Today, she will be sharing insights on current and upcoming PFAS regulations and what they mean for manufacturers like you. Jill, thank you again for doing this. Why don't you get started by telling us a little bit about yourself and about your company?
Sure. So my name is Jill Trujillo. I am a senior project manager with Langan. We are an engineering and environmental consulting firm. We are multidisciplinary, so site civil, environmental, geotechnical, traffic, landscape architecture, you name it, we have probably done it. And as such, we work quite closely with folks in industry, managing a variety of projects across disciplines. One thing that we have been particularly focused on is how recent changes in our regulatory landscape impact our industrial clients. And PFAS is kind of the big elephant in the room. So I thought I would talk today about PFAS in industry across disciplines and how these regulations or up and coming regulations may impact industries across the state and across the country.
That's great, Jill. Thank you so much.
So I want to talk first about permitting and compliance. So we know that as we develop sites, as we seek to expand our industrial footprint, we need to seek permitting and compliance as appropriate for whatever it is that we're trying to do. And when it comes to PFAS and permitting and compliance, it really is a multimedia issue. So what do I mean by that? I mean, it impacts industrial wastewater and stormwater. It impacts hazardous waste. It impacts the toxic release inventory, so RCRA, CERCLA, as well as drinking water. So we really see PFAS impacting all types of industry and throughout different media across industries. So no matter what you make, no matter where you make it, no matter what you need to transport on or off your site, it's very likely that PFAS is involved in some way, shape, or form if you utilize PFAS in any way. However, that being said, guidance is extremely limited and it's constantly changing across the regulatory landscape. So it's important to understand that our discussion today is a snapshot in time. This is changing sometimes day by day. It varies by state, it varies by media, and we are constantly evolving our understanding as to how these regulations apply to industry. So some important regulatory updates. The hazardous substance designation has the potential to be extremely impactful. So in May of last year, EPA finalized rulemaking that designated two different types of PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, as hazardous substances under CERCLA, so AKA Superfund. This means that there is potential enforcement on parties that significantly contributed. So significantly contributed typically excludes POTWs, publicly owned treatment works, landfills, local fire departments, and farmers, but certainly includes the vast majority of industry. This requires reporting of PFOA and PFOS releases in amounts that are greater than 1 pound over 24 hours. We have a really small threshold that we're dealing with. And it establishes sweeping liability for cleanup costs and damages. Remember that CERCLA liability is retroactive. So that means that this impacts existing cleanup and brownfield sites, as well as new development projects and can lead to reopeners. So this is a really important aspect when it comes to industry and industrial development, and it's something to keep in mind as you go through real estate transactions, because these transactions will need to include PFOA and PFOS to qualify for CERCLA defenses. It's just no longer a no scope consideration. We need to start considering the impact of PFAS, specifically PFOA and PFOS, under ASTM for phase ones. There's a lot of renewed scrutiny in real estate transactions. There's some pretty strict liability for owners of affected properties, and that's kind of regardless of responsibility for whomever caused PFAS contamination. So this is a really important update. We are expecting to see additional PFAS added to this designation. Right now, there are only 2, but there are likely more to come. There's a lot more to consider with respect to hazardous substance designation and waste management. And I think waste management is one of the largest components and one of the largest questions that we get asked from various clients across industry. What do we do with this waste? What are we supposed to do? We've quantified it, we've categorized it, we know we need to report it, but what do we actually do with it? In October of 23, so a little, a year and a half ago, the EPA finalized the TSCA reporting. And this, simply put, states that companies that manufacture PFAS since January of 2011 must submit information to the EPA. What information must they submit? And the reporting rule is a little vague on this, but ultimately it boils down to information pertaining to where in the supply chain are there PFAS. What information on impacts of PFAS does the company have? And is there a record of, and if there is, who has been exposed to PFAS? And of course, our more vulnerable groups are the groups that the EPA is primarily concerned with, children, etc. But that report of any potential exposure is included in this kind of overarching reporting. Under RCRA, PFAS compounds are not yet classified as hazardous waste, but there is a proposed rule that's been published. The reporting period for this TSCA reporting rule begins in July of this year. So it's been delayed, and that delay, initially the reporting period was meant to begin in January of this year, and they've bumped it out, the EPA's bumped it out. But that reporting period now begins in July of this year. So if you are a company that manufactures any PFAS or PFAS-containing substances, then this reporting rule is about to kick in. You've got about 6 months. Under this updated rule, things to be aware of, updated SDSs should be requested from chemical vendors. If you have vendors who haven't provided updated SDSs recently, it would be a really good idea to reach out to those folks now so you can start thinking about compiling this information. This is something that Langan can assist with. We have a fun PFAS tool that kind of lets us identify within the SDSs any compounds that are PFAS containing. It can be really difficult to sift through all of these extremely long chemical names that are listed on these SDSs and figure out, is that PFAS or is it not? And the TSCA reporting rule has over 1,000 different compounds that are listed as technically PFAS containing under it. So it can just be quite burdensome. But if you're aware that it's coming and you start to make these types of preparations now, the pain point of beginning this initial reporting can be alleviated somewhat. A little bit more about the proposed rule under RCRA. The proposed rule is to add 9 PFAS to the list of hazardous constituents. They're proposing to clarify by regulation that emerging contaminants, such as PFAS, can be addressed under RCRA. So right now, emerging contaminants typically aren't addressed under RCRA, but that's being clarified within this proposed rule. And this really expands our entire universe, right? When we think about sites that, perhaps we are looking to acquire, or sites that are ongoing, that are subject to RCRA corrective action, this completely expands those potential sites to include sites that contain PFAS. it lays the groundwork to regulate PFAS as hazardous under subtitle C regulation. So this is going to impact what can we do with this waste once we characterize it. They will be automatically considered hazardous substances under CERCLA once they're designated as hazardous. So those two things will click into place immediately upon final promulgation of this rule. And then the last major mechanism that happens here is that under this rule, EPA's authority is expanded to require cleanup of PFAS-contaminated facilities and can potentially trigger reopenings. So as you're looking to expand, develop, acquire other industrial sites like have been used prior, it is, a risk management strategy to consider PFAS when making decisions. So let's talk a little bit about facilities that are currently, manufacturing, moving along, doing business, and the toxic release inventory. So the TRI, toxic release inventory, applies to those substances that are listed that have been manufactured, processed, or otherwise used. So remember in your head, manufactured, processed, or otherwise used. If you have a constituent that has been manufactured, processed, or otherwise used and exceeds reporting thresholds, it needs to be reported under TRI. We have seen now increased reporting requirements for PFAS go into effect, effective November of 2023. This has designated PFAS as chemicals of special concern. And oftentimes there are what's called de minimis exemptions for certain constituents. If it's below a threshold, you don't need to report it. If it's a trade secret, it's not listed in an SDS, you don't need to report it. Those de minimis exemptions have been eliminated for PFAS under TRI. There are over 189 compounds now, PFAS compounds that have been added to the TRI, and these reporting requirements apply to reporting year beginning 2024. So that means right now, the reports that you're preparing that are due July 1st reflect reporting year 2024. So all of this information, like I said, we need to start thinking about these things because the reporting deadlines are coming up, and these changes affect reporting for last year, for the year prior. I want to focus in on AFFF. I think in industry, we know that AFFF in the past has commonly contained PFAS compounds. It's typically used for firefighting. It's commonly used at airports, chemical or energy plants, oil storage facilities, et cetera, et cetera. There are very significant challenges when it comes to changing out AFFF systems, and PFAS molecular characteristics are one of them because those characteristics change depending on what version of AFFF your facility might be using. There are really, really low remediation goals associated with AFFF release that contains PFAS. And AFFF typically rebounds from solid surfaces, right? So it's not, it's spreading itself out throughout the site. We see remediation locations with plumes of PFAS in soil because of these AFFF releases and because of that, those compounds being spread throughout the site. So remember, manufactured, processed, or otherwise used. Storage of AFFF on site does not constitute manufactured, processed, or otherwise used. And the EPA has some very specific exemptions when it comes to PFAS reporting under TRI for AFFF. And we can help, work through those exemptions on a site-by-site, company-by-company basis. But it's very important to understand that just because you have AFFF doesn't necessarily mean that you need to report it. However, if there's testing and uncontrolled release, then that may trigger reporting under TRI for PFAS. So we need to be very critical of how we handle those situations on a case-by-case basis. We also need to be cognizant of how some of these regulations play with one another. So we're talking about TRI reporting now. If we have an AFFF release and we report it under TRI, but some of that gets into water, now we start talking about PFAS and waste and how it impacts direct and indirect dischargers. So that's my natural segue. And I'm happy to talk more about AFFF and those various exemptions either at the end or if anybody has questions, my contact information is at the end here, but I'm going to move on to wastewater. Under the Clean Water Act right now, we see a lot of PFAS data collection, but we are not currently seeing any promulgated limits for PFAS. So under MPDES permits, for direct dischargers, under general permits, we aren't seeing specific limits for different PFAS. So if you have a discharge permit, you're not being given enough that you have for various PFAS components. However, the vast majority of permits, as they're being reissued, or the vast majority of new permits, contains what's called a monitoring and reporting requirement. So the state is saying, we want you to look for it, and we want you to tell us what you find, but we're not giving you a limit yet. The primary focus has been on publicly owned treatment works and management of sludges. So, publicly owned treatment works receive a variety of industrial wastewater. So right now, the focus has been on, well, what do PFAS concentrations look like at the POTWs? And then they'll kind of move upstream from there. And then management of land applied sludge is really important because there are some soil remediation guidelines associated with PFAS in the state of Connecticut. We see limitations being implemented on a very case-by-case basis. It's typically if there's some type of identified problem. So I want to say it's unlikely, but it's definitely something to consider if your facility requires or will require in the future any type of MPDES permit or any type of wastewater discharge permit to the local POTW. It's very likely that we'll see future limitations on the stormwater side. We haven't really seen a whole lot of that yet, but as regulations continue to change and as the various media kind of get checked off EPA's list, stormwater is likely next. So let's talk about some specific examples of PFAS and MPDES permitting in industrial wastewater. For now, like I said, industrial stormwater applicants have kind of dodged the bullet, but industrial wastewater hasn't quite been so far. In December, for example, Pennsylvania updated its MPDES individual industrial wastewater permit to establish PFAS monitoring and reporting requirements. Connecticut has not yet done this, but I did see the draft dewatering permit, and it does list required methods of PFAS testing. So I don't think that there will be any limits involved, but they're starting to write it into updated general permits in Connecticut. Florida, on an individual basis, is requiring PFAS testing for individual dischargers, and New Jersey is requiring PFAS monitoring as well for individual industrial dischargers. So if you're covered with the general permit, it might take a little longer to see this, but if you have a large individual industrial wastewater permit, this is something to be aware of. And then last but not least, honorable mention, I guess, drinking water may not be directly relevant to industry, but it is worth noting that national primary drinking water standards have been finalized for PFAS. They're shown here on the screen. They're very low. And I think overarchingly, the thing to bear in mind with these promulgated standards is that within the next 3 years, public water utilities will be required to start reporting for PFAS. And as that reporting becomes available and comes under scrutiny, there's going to be source assessment that is likely required if these limits are exceeded. And what that means for our folks, for our industrial clients, is that an understanding of potential PFAS sources at your facility may be very relevant to any source assessments that come down the pipeline, come down the pipeline when these drinking water utilities start to collect this information and report it. So again, thinking about it just from a risk management standpoint, it's important to consider, your sources on site and how those are being managed. Overall, that's kind of my spiel. The PFAS train has arrived. We keep on talking about, it's coming, it's here, it's at the station. We're figuring it out. We've seen the vast majority of our clients become more proactive by necessity. We still have time to be proactive, which is really, really important. We have time to collect the information. We have time to decide what our risk tolerance is and how we want to manage that risk. And then be prepared when that July 1st reporting deadline comes for TRI. Be prepared for that updated individual discharge permit that requires monitoring and reporting. It's important to start having these conversations. We are here as a partner. Langan is here as a partner. My contact information is on the screen. Please email me, call me with questions, concerns. We are staying abreast of these changes and following them as closely as we can. And that's really all I have.
Jill, thank you so much. That makes complete sense. And I appreciate you putting your contact information, because one of the questions I was going to ask was how they could reach you and how accessible you are. I jotted down just a couple of things. One is you mentioned a fun worksheet that you had access to that would kind of summarize things. Is that something that if they contacted you, you'd be able to share? Does it live on your website? Would that be accessible?
It's a pretty robust internal tool that uses. It has a lot of embedded smart cubes and calculations. So it's not something I could share, but it is something that can be used to quickly identify if there are SDSs that have PFAS containing constituents listed within them.
That makes sense. So somebody who might be watching or listening to us today could reach out to you and say, hey, quick question. Can you, help me brainstorm this or look up this information or point me in the right direction? We could maybe take it from there.
Yes. And I will say that if you see something that says fluoro, it's probably PFAS.
Okay.
So it's fluorinated compounds. That fluoro designation is usually your first clue that you've got something in there that's going to be categorized as PFAS.
Okay. I'm not even going to pretend like I'm an expert on this, but I do appreciate you taking the time. The other thing I noted was when you quoted or otherwise used. And as someone who's clearly not familiar, I thought, well, that is a very broad description.
It is. That's always a fun one, or otherwise used. And that's why I say it's really a case by case basis. But manufacturing or processing is a pretty a tight definition. You make it or you use it explicitly within your process. Otherwise used can mean that it's a byproduct of something that's being done on site, or it's contained within a chemical that's being used as part of it's a surfactant, right? It's not something that you're using to make whatever it is that you're making on site, but when you do your cleaning at the end of the day, it's in there. That's otherwise used, right? So those are some good examples, but it's very broad, and unfortunately it's broad for a reason. It's kind of that catch-all. And because of the elimination of that de minimis threshold, right, there's no quantity small enough where now we don't have to look into this. It becomes increasingly important to kind of try to examine that otherwise used more closely and make sure that you're not triggering any.
Well, I feel better knowing there are people like you who are excited about this stuff and who are guiding our members. Thank you so much for doing this. You guys are such great partners. And thanks for sharing your contact information. And we will make sure to get this out and point them in the right direction. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you for watching Inside Exchange, Topics for Manufacturers. We hope you found today's episode valuable. To learn more about the Council of Industry and explore additional resources, visit us at councilofindustry.org.